Don't you hate weeds? Ever tried doing gardening and all you can produce is weeds? Well, I guess that's a fact of life. They just come up without you trying. The trouble with weeds is if you don't deal with them right away, they become a problem. Well, they're a problem anyway, but they become a bigger problem. The longer you leave a weed in, the bigger problem it becomes. If you pull the weed out while it's still small, you've got a good chance of getting it out properly. But if you're lazy, like I am sometimes when it comes to gardening, and you leave the weeds in just a little bit too long, and they grow a little bit bigger, and the roots go down a bit deeper, eventually you get to the place where it becomes more difficult to get them out. And the tree's been growing for a long time, and its root begins to go down into the ground. It comes to the place where eventually you can't get the tree out. You can cut it off, you can leave the stump there, but the roots are still in the ground. And while the roots are still in the ground, the tree is going to grow back again. It's going to produce again, come back into action. Now, there's another solution that you can use, and this is the one that I resorted to last year when the weeds grew in the garden, eventually became so high that I couldn't pull them out. I decided that I would convert my weeds into lawn. So I took the lawnmower and mowed them down about that high. Hey, it made the ground look green. Looked like lawn, I thought. But you know, amongst those weeds were some of these things that produce the great big devil thorns. And what looked like beautiful lawn turned out to be not such beautiful lawn. And the poor kids decided to go out and play in the garden and came running in pain with thorns in their feet. It was a false solution. My laziness caused a bit of trouble. I was supposed to have pulled the weeds out while I could. I left them in, and it caused a problem. So why am I talking about weeds tonight? I want to speak about a root of the flesh. As we continue looking at the subject of counseling, we considered that there are basically three roots to the flesh. Tonight I want to look at just one of those roots, and it's the main root of the flesh. It is the tap root of the flesh. When that tap root of the flesh goes down, it becomes like a weed. Eventually it grows down deep, and it becomes very, very difficult to get it out. And while that root remains there, it continues to pour forth fruit. It continues to bear forth and to cause growth and to produce in your life the fruits of sin and of the flesh. What am I speaking about? I'm speaking about the root of bitterness. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 14 says this: "Follow peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. Looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person, such as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright." This passage speaks to us about the roots of the flesh. And there are three roots that are mentioned there. The very first one that is spoken of is the root of bitterness. It is the tap root. It is the main one. It is listed first because it is the main root that gives rise to everything else. And then you see the root of lust that comes next. And then you see the root of temporal things and temporal values that comes second. The three roots of the flesh, which we considered before. Tonight I want to consider that tap root. It's very important that we look at it, because these three roots are the cause of every problem that we have in our lives and in our spiritual lives. And if the root of bitterness is the main root, the tap root, it is the main cause of problems we have in our lives. You say, "Well, I'm not bitter. Liar. If you have sin in your life, then bitterness is there, because it's the taproot of the flesh. And most people are not aware of the fact that it's there, of its existence, and they don't realize the danger that it's causing. And very often as I'm counseling with people and ministering to their needs, inevitably God begins by digging down and starting with the root of bitterness. And so people come and they present their problems. Well, I got a problem with my husband. I got a problem with my wife. We got financial difficulties. I'm afraid. I have a problem with jealousy. Doesn't matter what your problem is. Inevitably, as I begin to counsel the person, I start to deal with bitterness. You say, well, I've got this problem in my life, and what's the cause of the problem? Well, the cause of the problem is the root of bitterness. Huh? I don't see the connection. Well, I'm going to show you the connection tonight. I'm going to show you how important this concept is. I'm going to show you how important this root is, and how important it is for you to dig down and identify this root, because this root is likely to be the major cause of every problem that you have in your spiritual life. Where does bitterness come from? I want you to see way back in the Old Testament that bitterness is first mentioned. Way back in the book of Deuteronomy and chapter 29. Reading from verse 18, it says, lest there should be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away this day from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of these nations. Lest there should be among you a root that bears gall and wormwood. And it comes to pass, when he hears the words of this curse, that he bless himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, though I walk in the imagination of my heart, to add drunkenness to thirst. The Lord will not spare him. But then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against that man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under heaven. It's a serious thing, a root of bitterness. So where's the root of bitterness spoken about? It spoke about a root that bears gall and wormwood. Now, what's gall and wormwood? It's two sources of bitterness. One of those sources is external. The other source is internal. Well, what's wormwood? Well, I don't know what wormwood is, but I know it's bitter. It's a certain kind of plant, a certain kind of tree that contains a very, very bitter substance. If you drop that wood into water, the water becomes bitter. There's a lot of other plants that are like that. I remember when my kids were very small, my second eldest had a problem biting her nails. Man, she bit her nails until there was nothing left. You're biting into the flesh already. Nothing we could do to stop her biting her nails, so we went to the chemist and they recommended a certain substance that was made from bitter aloes. And you painted this on the nails of the child. And the next time the child put her fingers in her mouth to bite her nails, she decided it wasn't such a good idea anymore. It was horrible. It was vile. Bitter as gall. Ever heard that expression? We'll get to the gall next. Well, this was bitter as aloes. Or bitter as wormwood. It's an external thing that produced bitterness. Bitterness is a way of the world. And bitterness can come upon us from without. As we come under the influence of those that are round about us, you will find that you don't have to look very far to find bitterness. The world is full of strife and conflict and hatred and bitterness. And as we walk through this world, we become contaminated and we pick it up. We pick it up from the spirits of other people. We pick it up from their attitudes. We pick it up from their influence, and we begin to become like others. And we become arrogant, and we fight, and we become bitter. Bitterness also comes from gall. Well, what's gall? It's a part of the body. It's the gallbladder. Now, I remember when I was a kid, we used to grow chickens. We used to have chickens. Well, we used to grow them too. And sooner or later, when the chicken was fat enough, it was time to chop its head off and put it in the pot. Yeah, that was fun, chopping the chicken's head off, let me tell you, and watching it run without its head. But one thing I learned in watching my mother clean the chicken, and she cut it open and took all the insides out, and I saw this funny green looking thing, and I said, "What's that?" She said, "That's the gallbladder. We've got to make sure we don't rupture it. We've got to make sure we don't cut that thing, because if we cut that and that green stuff comes out, you can throw this chicken away. It's going to be bitter." Gall, the gallbladder. Well, what's the gallbladder? It's part of the body. It's inside you. This is a picture of internal bitterness. Bitterness that comes from within, the root of the flesh within. It spews out. It's like a swollen abscess that when you cut it, it spurts out horrible, pussy, bitter, vile material. Not a nice description, but bitterness is not a nice thing. But that's what bitterness is like when it's within. The gallbladder is used for digestion. When there's something the stomach cannot digest, it pours out its bile, which is a digestive fluid, to try and digest those bones and things that cannot be digested. And it sits inside and it digests and it churns. That's a perfect picture of bitterness. It churns and it churns and it digests. And it burns inside of you. Bitterness from within. Bitterness in your heart. But bitterness bears also a bitter fruit. Bitterness brings a curse in your life. We saw it there in the scripture. That God said when a person has this root that bears gall and wormwood, they are going to inherit the curses. And God is going to withdraw His blessing. And let that person not dare stand and say, "Well, I'm the blessed of the Lord," because you're under a curse. God said He'll wipe you out from under heaven. You will destroy yourself. And not only will you destroy yourself, you'll destroy all of those round about you. Because bitterness defiles and begins to influence everybody that's round about you. Bitterness opens the door wide for the enemy. In James chapter 3 verse 16 it says these words, "For where envying and strife exist, there is confusion and every evil activity." Confusion and every evil activity. Where strife abounds, where there is strife, Satan has license. Where there is bitterness, Satan will confuse. It's an open door for the enemy to walk in and to destroy. And then bitterness leads to the other roots. When bitterness is there, we end up finding sexual problems begin to arise in the life of the person. And so often in helping people identify these problems, sexual problems, you find that it traces back to a bad relationship with their father or their mother. And bitterness lies at the root of the sexual problem. The need for things begins to become connected with bitterness, and the root of temporal values begins to spring forth. And we have the full-blown roots of the flesh in the life of a person, giving forth sin and giving birth to every single kind of problem that you can have in your life. How do we notice bitterness? How do we identify it in a person? One of the first things you're going to notice is that the person is always complaining. They're always complaining. They're always dissatisfied. They're always groaning and moaning and complaining about something or someone. Nothing is right. Nobody's right. The government's wrong. The church is wrong. The pastor's wrong. The school is wrong. The work is wrong. Everything's wrong. Complain, moan, groan. Never happy. Just have a closer look and you'll start seeing some signs of a root of bitterness existing. Bitterness is always negative. Never says anything positive. Always negative. Always sees the evil. Always sees the bad. Always suspicious. All of these things come as a result of that root of bitterness in the life of a person. But the clearest sign of a root of bitterness in somebody is that the root of bitterness always needs something to spew out at. The root of bitterness always needs someone to be angry with. And you'll soon see in the life of a person who carries this root that they always have to have somebody to be mad at. And they tend to only be mad at one person at a time. If you got somebody with a root of bitterness that's mad at you, there's only one way to get that anger diverted away from you. Get them to be mad at somebody else. That's amazing. They hate you so they want to kill you until they get mad at somebody else, and then you're okay. Then you're fine. Then you're their friend again because they're mad at somebody else. Oh, it's terrible to be married to somebody like that. Been there, done that. It's not good. You got to get them mad at somebody else if they're mad at you. It's the only way you get off the hook. Because the root of bitterness will continue to spew. Continue to spew. And it always has to find an object on which to spew out at. Now, how does bitterness